And he's like my cousin, extended family. This morning, last evening, my wife said, I haven't been well the last week. Why are you going all the way? Bhubaneswar on a Saturday, you should be resting with us. So I reminded her, who has invited me. She's got a children from the class too. And she said, that you have to do, that's family. So I'm very happy to be here today. And to also have the pleasure of having you, Shri. I know you're making an exception to be here. So thank you so much, Mr. Dash, and ladies and gentlemen. When Professor Sahu asked me to speak at the foundation day of this eminent institute, the Center for Youth and Social Development, I didn't know what I would say, because you heard the description of me. You read out my association with capitalism and business and consulting for capitalists and the Federation of Indian Industry. And knowing you, you would say, that we can't be like-minded people at all. So I felt I might as well take the bull by the horns and talk about the crisis of capitalism. How is that? And I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to share thoughts on the crises of capitalism and democracy here in Indonesia, and especially at this institute. I do believe that there are these two crises, in a major crisis of thought in the world, and Indonesia is a place where it is playing out. That's what I wish to discuss with you. I think the course of the development of our country and Indonesia too is being shaped by this crisis, these crises. There are contradictions between the philosophy of capitalism and the real philosophy of democracy. I'll talk about that. Even within capitalism, there's a crisis, and within democracy also there's a crisis. And so we've got a rather confused state of what are the best guiding ideas to shape the world. I want to talk about India's future, and as a part of that, Odisha's future. We were led to believe by the BRICS projections that by 2040, India is destined to be an economic power in the same league as China and the USA. But many are dismayed by what is going on in the country today. We are one of the worst countries to do business in, according to international surveys. We have the largest number of malnourished children in the world. Our urban infrastructure is miserable. Our power system, most parts of the country, is limping, in some states too. And we must wonder, how will we get from here, that is our current reality, to there, our so-called great destiny. Many big forces are shaping India's future. One is demographics. India's demographic profile is expected to provide its economy with a dividend, propelling it, according to the BRICS projections and by several economic think tanks, also to become the third largest economy in the world after China and the USA. India has a huge population, and within it, a swelling number of young people. I had the privilege today of seeing and looking into the eyes of some of these young people who are training centers here in Odisha, who come from the tribal districts, what we consider to be some of the worst disturbed districts in terms of the conflict of ideas and conflicts of impact that development is having on the lives of people in this country, perhaps in the world. And to look in the eyes of these young people and wonder what their hopes are. And they look at me, those smart people come from their equal planning profession, but they know what it means to them. How do we connect? And so these are all the young people on whose backs we say India is going to be the world's third largest economy in the next 30 years. In 2010, the working age population, that is persons over 15 years old, was 1.1 million in China. In India was 850 million, that's 3 years ago. But India's population is much younger, and whereas the median age of China's population was then 34 years, as 3 years ago, in India it was only 25. And for comparison, the median age of the population of Europe is 43. So India has, by all accounts, the largest young population in the world. India's demographic profile is a certainty. The babies who will grow into the youth, forming India's population, are already born. We're going to change that. The number is going to be there. However, the form of other forces that will shape India's future is not fixed. And their forms can change over the next 20 years. And these are the forces of democracy, the force of capitalism, and government. And it is the condition of these forces that will determine whether or not India will realize its demographic dividend. Indeed, many fear that India's demographics could produce a disaster rather than a dividend. If India's millions of youth do not have good jobs and confidence in the institutions. In those young people I saw today, there was no anger in their eyes. There was a stillness. But I know that there are many other young people around them who got anger in their bodies now. And so when we talk of the demographic dividend, we are just around the corner, possibly having a demographic disaster also. Good institutions are critical for our future. Humanity is not distinguishable from other animals in the design of the process of producing babies. After all, the birds do it and the bees do it too. What does distinguish the human species from other animal species is the development of institutions by human beings. Institutions with which humanity obtains the ends it wants. And very powerful amongst these are the institutions of democracy, of capitalism, and of government. The way the cavemen and hunter-gatherers organize their affairs is not the way we organize our affairs now, though we reproduce babies in the same way. Over centuries, human beings have evolved. The institutions with which human society conducts its affairs in economic and political spheres. And institutions are like spaceships that we design to take us to the future we want for ourselves and our children and our grandchildren. And economists acknowledge the critical role that institutions play in producing economic growth. Countries with very similar resource endowments have different economic growth trajectories because they have different institutional capabilities in institutions of government, of business, and politics, democracy. The essence of humanity, therefore, in contrast to all other human species, is a conscious evolution of the concept of justice and the development of the means to ensure it. Therefore, humanity needs institutions not only to produce economic growth, but also for justice in society. In fact, humanity has applied the concept of the right to life of all living beings, even to the right of life of animals. With its desire to defend the rights of animals to also procreate and live, it now has to discover new policies and new institutional arrangements. And thus, we must reconcile somehow the rights of the little turtles on India's east coast versus the rights of the New and the right to survival of tribals in India's heartland with the right to livelihood of the tribal communities that have lived there for centuries too. These are all aspirations. And we have to find ways to reconcile them. Institutions of politics, democracy and government therefore must evolve in line with our evolving concepts of human rights. At the same time, we need increasing efficiency in the use of resources to produce the materials and services that human beings expect. Because not only are the natural resources available to us limited, but the pressure of numbers of people who depend on them is increasing. And nowhere is this pressure more than in India. India had a population of 300 million when we got our independence 65 years ago. We are now over 1.1 billion on the same land with the same sources of water. Standards of what is a good life have also changed meanwhile. To have a bicycle was a luxury for many middle-class Indians 65 years ago, but now it must be a car. And of course, the combination of increasing numbers and rising expectations creates a wonderful market for businesses, which is what makes India attractive for cooperation from all over the world. However, if the ways we produce, ways in which they produce, and what they produce and sell does not change, the limits of the environment could become a serious constraint even on business growth. Mankind is venturing further and further in its evolution in search of ever higher standards of justice and higher standards of consumption too. Institutions, as I had suggested before, are the spaceships in which we soar to the destinations that we aspire to reach. The institutions in which humanity is flying into the 21st century must be redesigned to meet rising standards of human rights as well as aspirations for what constitutes a good life in material terms. Signs of inadequacy of institutions are visible in many parts of the world, in revolts and revolutions, many peaceful fortunately, but several turning violent with impatience with the old order. Therefore, institutions of democracy, of capitalism and government must be reformed and evolved. And the shape in which they are now was evolved to the needs of previous times, I'll explain. And unless we change the design of these institutions and the way in which they function, we will not reach our goals. India, with its special demographic situation, which I mentioned, is very vulnerable to the consequence of inadequate or inappropriate institutions of democracy, of capitalism and government. Indeed, there is a growing mistrust in the country's institutions of political parties, of government and big business too. In a recent debate on TV, English TV, on whether India is ripe for a revolution, 60% of the audience, and this was a debate in Bombay, 60% of the audience, which was mostly middle-class youth in that city of Bombay, voted for the motion that India was ripe for a revolution. It's not a vision. The other 40% seemed confused on whether it would be a revolution or merely more revolts. This growing mistrust is leading more people to protest and to prevent changes in policies proposed by government and those advocated by business particularly. Thus, we have a policy logjam, the root cause of which is public mistrust of our institutions. And therefore, we must apply ourselves consciously to the condition of our institutions. I am focusing, therefore, to the root from which will come the goodness that we aspire to, which is good institutions. Institutional reform is necessary not only in government and political parties, but in business too. Unfortunately, the evidence around the world is that the pace at which business institutions are reforming themselves to meet the 21st century requirements of society is not sufficient. The World Value Survey provides a reliable towards business, and in recent years, attitudes of Indians as a whole have moved in anti-business direction. So, okay, I'm a capitalist and noticing the pressure on the capitalist class, the business class, to think inwardly that they have to change. Now, this surprised many people, this survey result, because business people mix and listen to people like them, and they watch those channels and parts of the media that is paid for by them in a way, and eulogize them. So they get surprised when they are told that an impartial objective survey done by an international organization says people don't trust them. On the question of whether private or government ownership of industries to be preferred in that survey, support for private ownership doubled between 1989 and 2007, from 11.2% to 23.2%. So businesses see more trust in us. But it tripled for government ownership from 11.4 to 33.1%. Let's look at another survey. That's the Edelman's Trust Barometer. The 2013 readings of this Edelman's Trust Barometer, which is a survey in 26 countries of citizens' trust in institutions, report that only 26% trust business leaders to solve social issues, and that only 19% expected business to make ethical decisions. Trust in government is even lower. But less corporate leaders gloat about the greater trust, albeit small, that citizens have in them over government. A survey in India earlier this year, 2013, which was done by CYSD for the magazine called Governance Now. They bring them business down the world. CYSD uses a concept it calls net trust. It reports that whereas net trust in private industry was 64%, which is higher than 54% in government, citizens' net trust in social organizations was much higher at 75%. Congratulations. And citizens' net trust, and I have to say this to my friends in business, citizens' net trust in India, in labor unions, is 73%, much higher than in private corporations. So business institutions have great need to introspect and to change themselves voluntarily. Democracy and government belong to everybody, even to business. But by definition, in a capitalist system based on private property rights, capitalist enterprises belong only to their owners. Therefore, others have no right to interfere in their conduct. Most of our laws and rules of corporate governance are designed to ensure that all the shareholders of the corporation get a fair deal, and that the rights of the minority owners are protected vis-a-vis the promoters and large shareholders of the corporation. That's what corporate governance is about. But these are internal matters, not politics. Government regulation of corporate conduct and other matters that affect society has been strongly resisted by capitalists on ideological grounds. The ideology is that business must be left alone as much as possible, and that business's animal spirits must not be curbed. Well, if businesses must not be regulated from the outside, then they must take responsibility to regulate themselves and redesign their own institutions in a credible manner. When I joined the Planning Commission as a member in 2009, one of the tasks that the Prime Minister assigned to me, I came out of, they said, a non-government word, was to determine what the role of the Planning Commission should be in the 21st century. I asked Govt, the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, to give me a list of 20 persons to whom I should ask this question. He gave me a list of 20 respected citizens of our country. Some of them had worked in government in very senior positions, some in the Reserve Bank, some parliamentarians, and some even in the Planning Commission in the past. And several others amongst these 20 were respected industrialists in the country. And I asked each of these 20 leaders the following questions. 1. Is the Planning Commission playing a useful role for the country? And number 2, if not, is there another role that the Planning Commission could play in India's progress? The answer to the first question was unanimous. The Planning Commission was no longer making a significant contribution to the progress of business. We agree. The country had changed. It was more decentralized politically and administratively than when the Commission was founded 63 years ago. The private sector was playing an increasingly large role now. The Indian economy was also more connected with the international economy. And for all these reasons, 5-year plans and budgets made by some experts in Delhi, which had then to be implemented by people all over the country, was an outmoded idea. However, everyone, including the industrialists, said that the dynamic nature of changes in India and outside required a strategic group that, like a radar, could sense the forces that were causing change to happen, and that would provide governments in the center and in the states, and private industry too, with insights into the forces shaping the future. I will now give you a picture of the forces shaping our future. And I will also explain their effects on institutions of capitalism, democracy, and government. Now, I use two images for you to visualize these sources and their implications. One is an image of a storm, and the other an image of a grove in stress. I'll now flesh out these images. First, the image of the storm. Many of you may recollect, if you read it, the book called The Perfect Storm with Sebastian Junger, written, and there's a movie on that one. When not two, but three storm systems converged in the North Atlantic. And this was unprecedented. And no ship had been designed for such conditions. Three storms had to get. And no captain had the skills to steer the ship in such a, as he called it, perfect storm. As the 21st century unfolds, there are actually four strong winds blowing across the world and converging to create a more than perfect storm, which is challenging capitals of government institutions and of business institutions that are not designed for these conditions. The first strong wind is the idea of free markets and capitalism. This is not a new idea. It's often attributed to Adam Smith, and it's been around for at least 200 years. With the spread of free markets everywhere, and into India too, with the opening of our economy in the 1990s, economies of many countries, including ours, have been growing faster. Most noteworthy is the growth of the 2 billion people plus countries as China and ourselves, India. And the growth in our economies is enabling many millions of people to escape poverty. Economic growth in free markets follows the principle of cumulative causation. As the market is opened up, those who already have some assets, and they could be financial assets or educational assets or access to political power, they can take advantage of the new opportunities available. And therefore, their incomes and wealth grows faster than those who do not have these assets. And thus, economic growth in free markets is always accompanied by increases in gaps of employment. So it is no surprise that Gini coefficients are increasing in China, Russia, India, and in other countries that have embraced the free market and capitalism. In time, the benefits of economic growth trickle down to the poorer people when they begin to acquire access to education, finance, and employment opportunities. And in this model, one must be patient. And in this model, to force redistribution is socialist and therefore wrong. Whereas to induce the rich to accelerate growth of their assets by giving them tax breaks so that the economy can become larger is capitalist and is acceptable. The second wind that has been gaining strength across the world is respect for the right of all human beings, white or black, male or female, rich or poor. And this is the more recent force than capitalism. Indeed, many countries, such as the USA, that have been stoutly capitalist actually for centuries, have only in the last 50 years addressed the rights of large sections of their population, such as the blacks in their own country. This force of respecting the rights of all combines better with the idea of democracy. It has been gaining a lot of strength in the last 2 decades with the collapse of the totalitarian governments in the Soviet Union and the revolutions of the Arab Spring. Blowing around deep within the second strong wind of democracy is the notion of justice, of equity and fairness. Whereas from the perspective of economists, there may be nothing wrong when disparities increasing as economies grow. It is part of the game, they may say. But is it fair from a human perspective to ask others? The third force is a voice speaking loudly to us and literally out of the earth. There is a concern everywhere with the state of the environment. Madam spoke about water. Now we all agree that the paradigm of economic growth that has brought the rich countries their wealth is not sustainable. As this blog post in The Economist pointed out, we are guzzling down the earth. The USA's footprint on the Earth's resources is as heavy as 9.7 hectares per person. It's a measure of how much the people of that part of the world or country are drawing resources of the earth. The USA's global footprint 9.7 hectares per person. Europe and Japan's footprints are half of that, 4.7 hectares per person. China's 1/6 of the USA, 1.6 hectares per person. And India's is half of China's, 0.8 hectares per person. So an Indian consumes 1/12 of the Earth's resources compared to an American. Scientists project that if India and China, which will consume more of the Earth's resources as their economies grow, if we were to have a global footprint equal to Japan's only, which is less than half of the US, by 2030, is not too far away, these two countries' economies would require another whole planet Earth to support them alone. So India and China will need one more Earth if you're going to keep this present paradigm of growth and development and to satisfy the needs of 2.5 to 3 billion people between ourselves. But we have only one Earth to share amongst the rich countries in the 4 of us. The fourth wind, which is of more recent origin, is the gale force of information. Within the last 20 years only, telecommunications and the internet have enabled people to reach out and be reached in a way unprecedented in human history. And this wind has become a category 6 storm. So now you can sit here and instantly call anywhere in the world on a cell phone. 20 years ago, just 20 years ago, you could not do this. Not even in the USA. Now cell phones are in the hands of poor people and all over India. I was told when I visited these training centers today, when they get these young men from the tribal areas to enable them to be in touch with their families, one thing they depends on their life is a sense of touch. So yes, they can connect instantly anytime they wish to with people living as we might think about in conditions thousands of years ago. Now you can go on the internet and Google and find information on almost everything or anything. And you could not do this just 15 years ago. Television, which picks up information from these ubiquitous sources of information, reaches almost everywhere. India has over 120 24/7 news channels today in ways they were not just a few years ago, So with these 4 storm winds now converging, a more than perfect storm has formed. With information flowing around and many more voices being heard, 2 major concerns can be heard more loudly in the storm about the way the world is progressing. One is our pattern of economic growth is not sustainable. And the other is our pattern of economic growth is not fair. These concerns are putting pressure on institutions of capitalism, government and democracy to reform themselves to make economic growth more sustainable, more inclusive and more fair. Now my first image was the more than perfect storm, with these 4 forces converging in the 21st century, putting pressure on the institutions of government, democracy and capitalism. My second image is a rumbling earthquake, with institutions of capitalism, democracy and government grating against each other like 3 tectonic plates. And the misalignment amongst these plates is creating tremors in global governance also. Thomas Friedman said that the world has become flat. It has been flattened, according to him, by the force of global trade and international businesses spreading across the world, fueled by new technologies. Countries competing for FDI from MNCs are accelerating the spread of MNCs. And Friedman writes in the book, companies have never had more freedom and less friction in the way they operate. The biggest source of friction, of course, has always been, he says, quoting him, the nation state, with its clearly defined boundaries and walls. What this will mean for the long-term relationship between companies and the country in which they are headquartered is simply unclear. Unquote. The second plate then is the world of nations with their boundaries and their governments. There are many tensions within national governments with demands to improve justice within their national boundaries. At the same time, attempts to create democratic forms of governance that cross national boundaries are under strain too. The European Union is clearly stressed at the moment. The WTO is fluttering along International negotiations to create a global regime for governance and environment have gone from Rio to Kyoto to Bali, Copenhagen, Durban to Rio again 20 years later without having gone anywhere. MNCs and global finance float above the plate of national governments and they cross national boundaries. A deeper tectonic plate within the earth, also cutting across national boundaries, is communities of identity. And the roots of many communities go back into history and traditions, predating by centuries present national boundaries that have either divided such communities or sought to contain them. All over the world, there are communities divided by national boundaries. In Korea, China, Taiwan, India, Pakistan, Northern Ireland, Israel, Palestine, Sudan, Kurds in Iraq, Syria, Turkey. At the same time, there are many communities within national boundaries whose historical roots require special attention. The Basques in Spain, the Tamils in Sri Lanka, communities within Nigeria, multiple communities within India, in our northeast, the tribal communities within our heartland, and the list goes on. Friedman's earlier book, The Lexus and the Olive Tree, written prior to 9/11, described two forces in contention. The Lexus, according to him, the Lexus represented the forces of global business and global brands. The olive tree, in his book, represented the fundamentalists of the world, forces of tradition, religion, and identity. And he was convinced that it was a matter of time only, and the force of the Lexus would wipe out the olive tree. However, he did not realize how deep-rooted the olive tree is. 9/11 in the United States was a wake-up call. The olive tree had reacted to being smothered and used the same forces of technology that are supposedly flanking the world to strike back at the empire. The terrorists used the internet, they used cell phones, they used the UPS as the public mail system of the US and commercial airliners in their strike that flattened the World Trade Center. The Indian people tree is also very strong. You ceaselessly or endlessly leave a seed in the water in which the concrete is mixed. And the people tree will break through the concrete after the house is built. Plaster it over again, and yet the shoots will reappear, as I have observed in a little rooftop apartment that I have in Pune, where a people tree kept emerging no matter what technology we used to try and suppress it. This was on the third floor. Someone had kept taking the concrete. Almost every other year, there are people trees dropping out of the concrete. So the roots of our traditions, the roots of our identity go very deep, and technology is not very easily small. The plate of government sits in the fourth line between, on the top, the plate of capitalism and free markets, and below, the plate of democracy, as I described it now, beneath. And the world will keep shaking as these three tectonic plates grating against each other until a system of governance can be found to align them all. Capitalism, democracy, even environmentalism have become ideologies. Francis Fukuyama, in his treatise The End of History, had said that the history of ideological conflict had ended in 1989 with the fall of the Soviet Union. He said the Western ideas of free market capitalism and electoral democracy had triumphed over state-run economies and totalitarian governments. It is ironic that the ideological conflicts that have emerged since 1989 with the arising of the more than perfect storm I'm describing are between institutions of capitalism and institutions of democracy, the two supposed victors after Fukuyama's historical war. So those are the two institutions who got internal crises and then a conflict amongst them. In his book, False Novel, John Reagan, conservative political thinker and former advisor to Margaret Thatcher, warns that democracy and the free market are rivals, they are not allies. Benjamin Barber, another economist, says, markets are simply not designed to do the things democratic politics or free civil societies do. Markets give us private, not public modes of discourse. We pay as consumers in currencies of consumption, but we cannot use this currency when we deal with one another as citizens or neighbors about the social consequences of our private market choices, unquote. And Lester Thoreau says in The Future of Capitalism, another economist from MIT, that democracy and capitalism have very different beliefs about the proper distribution of power. One believes in a completely equal distribution of political power, one man, one woman, one vote, while the other believes that it is the duty of the economically fit to drive the unfit out of business and into economic extinction. These are the underlying principles. Survival of the fittest is what capitalist efficiency is all about, he says. India embraced democracy at its birth 60 years ago. Then 20 years ago, it also veered towards free market capitalism. The opening of markets and unleashing of capitalism in India has undoubtedly accelerated economic growth, and wealth has begun to accumulate. Forbes magazine had forecasted a few years ago that before 2020, India will have the most billionaires in the world. But for India to realize the demographic dividend from its children, which economists say will prepare India to be the third largest economy in the world within just 3 decades, India will have to take care of all its children, including the malnourished and undereducated children who are more than half our people, and not just the regular. And seeing the young men today from the tribal districts here in Odisha, unless they are shoulder to shoulder building the new India, we are not going to rely on them. The development of institutions that conform to both democratic principles as well as market capitalist ideas is human history's unfinished task. An Indian monarch had taken up this task 2,500 years ago. Kautilya, Emperor Chandragupta Maurya's chief minister, who wrote the Arthashastra, the science of wealth, in the 4th century BC, is considered the world's first economist. He laid down detailed requirements for increasing the GDP of the state and its administration. And on this foundation, Chandragupta's grandson, Emperor Ashoka, wished to construct a state that would protect the rights of all living beings, human and animal, and also protect the forests and rivers. He was the world's first environmentalist, Ashoka. He could not realize his vision to harmonize the science of wealth and power, the Arthashastra, with the ethics of humanity and nature before he died. The Linga is very important. Awakening. It's not far. So therefore I say, Odisha has a place in shaping the ideas that will shape the world. And it has become modern India's destiny to finish the task. The Indian political landscape is churning. Parties of left, right and centre are maneuvering for electric space right now. While the West often tries to discuss the world in black and white terms, this I'm quoting now Kishore from Singapore, the Indian mind is able to see the world in many different colours. Therefore, I ask, could India provide the bridge between free market capitalism and democracy? Actually, he'd asked the question in the book too. So the world is looking to us, and we are looking to us Indians here in Odisha and yourselves in the leadership by making some connections that we truly need to make with people in this country, amongst ourselves. This system, this new system must have two essential requirements. Firstly, a just system must be based on the so-called self-evident principle that the US founding fathers had laid down, that all peoples are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, even if they're not equally rich or equally powerful. And I must say again, looking into those eyes of the today, I have to ask, they are equal to me and better perhaps. They have rights more than I have. This principle is the heart of the democratic ideal to take civilization to a higher order. Secondly, this new system must be founded on the principle that business and the economy are not the be-all and the end-all of life. Social and political aspirations are part of human reality. The challenge before us as we march into the 21st century is to make capitalism and economics our tools rather than human beings becoming their tools. Therefore, let us first determine our aspirations and principles and accordingly devise the form of capitalism and economics that we want. So what is our vision of our future? How will we shape our institutions of democracy and capitalism to create a just, inclusive, sustainable, and economically vibrant society? And let me offer you a personal vision of inclusive, democratic capitalism. In this vision, democracy will become deep and will become inclusive. Democratic governments are expected to be governments of the people, for the people, and by the people. We have the largest electoral democracy in the world. We conduct elections on a scale that no other country comes close to. Our governments are elected by the people. Therefore, we have governments of the people in our states and at the national level. But people want their governments to be for them too. Indians are protesting that their governments are not accountable to the people. They are demanding transparency. So, yourself, showing people are demanding transparency. That's a very important role to play. They want to know what was done with the money that was supposed to be spent to improve public services and public infrastructure. This is the core demand of the anti-corruption movements. Therefore, governance reforms to make governments accountable to citizens have become imperative. Deep democracy, though, is government by the people. A democracy where citizenship is not merely the right to vote members of assemblies, but a democracy in which citizenship is also the active management by people of their own affairs in their communities and local bodies. Not an election-time democracy, but a deliberative democracy in which citizenship is the right to understand the rules and to shape the rules by which society governs itself, the people themselves. And that's where your great institution is in the vanguard of keeping alive a flame which often seems to die, that we have to enable our people to govern themselves in our local communities, even if they are, as we might consider to be, within jungles. Therefore, India has a long way to go. When our elected representatives say, you have elected us, now keep quiet and leave it to us till we come back for your votes next time. We've been hearing this in much of last year. They are killing the very concept of deliberative deep democracy. Moreover, deep democracy requires elected and accountable governments, like I said, in our villages and our urban localities. We have passed the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments 20 years ago, but we have not made much progress in implementing them. Madam, when you ask, if we have visions and take decisions and make technical laws, do we implement them? India must become also an inclusive economy. I humbly submit that genuine inclusion is not achieved by handouts and by redistribution. In fact, handing out and charity reinforce the idea of exclusion. Some are in and others are out. And it is the moral responsibility of the aims to give to those who are out. Those who are excluded become genuinely included only when they have equal opportunities to earn and live dignified lives and to contribute by their efforts to the creation of the wealth of the whole society. Just as institutions of government must be reformed to create an inclusive democracy, institutions of business and capitalism must be reformed to create an inclusive economy. Therefore, businesses must be not only for the people, they must also be by the people, and they must be of the people. For inclusion, we need innovations to provide affordable and accessible goods and services, especially at the bottom of the economic pyramid. And this is the business opportunity for profit at the bottom of the pyramid that Professor C.K. Prasad had written about, and that many entrepreneurs are pursuing. By producing products and services for poorer people, the business. And therefore we need innovations in production models that provide more jobs so that business is by the people too. Now, employees in enterprises owned by others have incomes, but do not have a share in the creation of the wealth of those enterprises. And the fruits of that go entirely to the owners. For a fuller inclusion in the benefits of growth, we need more enterprises in which the producers and workers share the wealth creation. This requires innovations in enterprise design and governance models to shape businesses of the people. Talk of producer societies, we were talking earlier about providing credit facilities to self-help groups and doing groups. So they can manage their lives and conduct businesses, which brings them some income. In my vision of India, India, which is a country of over 1 billion democrats, will also be a country of hundreds of millions of captains. So don't throw it away. Indeed, this was Mahatma Gandhi's vision. His charter was a symbol. In his vision for India, all people would be producers of goods and services that the community and the market need. They would be earners and also owners of their enterprises, even if tiny. Finally, in my vision, India will also be what Gurudev Tagore envisioned, a country not divided into fragments by narrow domestic walls. Therefore, let us be less argumentative and more cooperative. Let us strive together towards the heaven of freedom, a country in which every citizen has all three freedoms: political freedom, social freedom, and economic freedom. Each of us has work to do to reform the institutions we are in charge of and in which we must work. Some of us must lead and reform business corporations and other capitalist institutions. Others amongst us must lead and reform governments and government institutions. And many others must lead and reform institutions of democratic representation, political parties, civil society organizations, and unions. We each have to reform and improve our institutions. Who will lead? We need leaders who have the wisdom and the courage to reform the institutions they are given to lead. As Mahatma Gandhi said, we do not own institutions, we are their trustees. We must build society's trust in the institutions we lead. I conclude with my definition of the leader. Leaders come in many shapes and they have many styles. And regardless of their shape, size and style, a real leader is she or he who takes the first steps toward what she or he deeply cares about. Leaders are those who take the first steps, not those who wait for others to lead. They are followers. Great leaders have many followers because the steps they take are not towards selfish goals, but towards goals that others aspire to also. The heart of leadership is the deep caring for the cause. And the awakening of leadership in each of us will arise when we look into ourselves and ask what we really care about. We really care about deep down. Not what we are taught to care about by the manipulators of carrots dangled before us and the wielders of sticks to prod us with the so-called incentives that economists say make so-called rational human beings do what they do. Carrots and sticks make us the tools of others. They are the means to make donkeys move and not human beings. The poet Robert Frost said, "When to the heart of man was it less than treason to go with the drift of sins and just leave the place to reason?" We must look inside our hearts for what we want to make our world and country, not only for our own sakes, but our children's too. And we must stir our human aspirations to take steps now together to shape the future that we all want. Thank you so much.